You find in areas like Sussex, Horsham, and some areas in Surrey and Crawley as well, where the councils have just stopped issuing planning consents, or they've, just before committees, they've pulled planning consents, or they've advised, well, we really can't move forward with the scheme before you can actually demonstrate that your site is water neutral. Mm-hmm. There are two parameters. There's a nitrate neutrality measure, which looks at the nitrates, and that there's a lot more work that has been done by Southern Water regarding opportunities for working with farmers and reducing, the nutrient in terms of pollution control, mm-hmm. and working on that side of it. But what's more difficult to do is how do you deal with the quantity? A recent publication by Natural England has indicated that they do have strong legal grounds to actually push this forward. Mm-hmm. It's one of those things that cannot be lobbied against or fought, because historically, coming from a development background, we've always had a knee-jerk reaction to any environmental endeavors. I would say we've reacted quite strongly. Mm-hmm. We had the Code for Sustainable Homes that was resisted quite strongly and lobbied off, and now we don't have it. Part of it is enshrined within the building regs, of course, but you could actually feel that when the Code for Sustainable Homes came to the table, there was a strong resistance against that protocol, and obviously, given my background both as an environmentalist and as an engineer, I could understand the frustration because it was a bit cumbersome in terms of dealing with, which we didn't make it the best opportunity to sell the environmental agenda. However, with all of these environmental items, you always need to start from the basics. That everything that you do, particularly on larger, even strategic sites, how it interacts with the environment, you need to look at it right from the onset. What are your requirements in terms of the demand? How can you influence it? How can you influence the design? Those are some of the things that we'll talk about later. But initially, when you're conceiving any development, is drifting away from being the number of units, but about the holistic approach. What are you building? You're building a community within a natural environment. Mm-hmm. You're not putting bricks or mortar to provide shelter for men who's conquering the environment. It's a different philosophy. And so if you engage, and if you particularly look at site, even by the time, most of the battle is lost by the time you get to master planning stage. Mm-hmm. If those issues are not well considered. Yeah,
it's those principles that kind of guide everything, isn't it, that's so important to make sure it's all ingrained from the start.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's how do you capture those opportunities in terms of the green, blue, natural environments? How do you make them an intrinsic part of your development? But, just dialing back onto that issue about the water neutrality, how we can actually look at innovative ways of dealing with it. Because at the moment, the councils have come up with the hierarchy of how you can actually address this issue. Mm-hmm. So at the top is obviously water efficiency. Now, water efficiency is good if you're working on a brownfield site where you can discount the existing demand mm-hmm. against the planning demand.
I find that interesting because I've worked on quite a few brownfield sites where there is very little demand for water because it's a car park or whatever else. So it does seem a bit strange that it's kind of discounted in a way.
Yeah, well,
I understand why on some places.
On some places, yeah, because if you're taking down an office building, for instance, mm-hmm. that would work. Yeah. If you're changing a golf course to a residential use or resort, for instance, that that's an opportunity there. When you look at the irrigation water, the demand of watering the greens and so forth. So in that context, it would work. If you're changing a site from a garden nursery to a residential, that's an opportunity again. But obviously for things like car park, you're nearly in that situation where it's just, there's no demand there. So it's like a greenfield. So if
would it still be counted the same way then as a greenfield, or would it, because it's brownfield, brownfield, it's still looked at the other way?
Well, because you've got nothing to discount. So you're allowed to discount, but you've got nothing, so it's zero. So it's up. So functionally, it just looks like a greenfield site.
Oh, right. So it's
in
based
terms of
more
watering,
that way. Okay, yeah.
In terms of
I wasn't sure how it was calculated, if it was based on something.
No, there's no
sort of a generic rule, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, the fundamental rules that you ought to apply is the actual water demand. Better still if you've got historic water bills, or in some instances, the water authorities and the councils are quite flexible in their approach, because they've allowed you to go all the way back to 20 years, or and so you could, if there's been various uses, there are some uses that would have triggered more water use than not. So you're almost in that situation where the conversation is, how can you maximize on those opportunities that needed more water that are no longer there, but within the last 10 to 20 years. For some sites, there's great opportunity to do that. But the challenge is, going forward, we've got 300,000 homes that need to be built per year. Most of those 300,000 homes are in the south, and particularly the southeast corner. We're talking about 1 million homes in the Oxford-Cambridge arc. So all of those items trigger a lot of demand in terms of the water regime. And all of those, particularly the Cambridge-Oxford arc, it sits on on top of a lot of chalk aquifers and chalk streams. So in terms of that big issue, already you can actually see that that's a potential massive issue that needs to be looked at all the way from the drawing board. It's the water infrastructure issue is going to be as important as access, as energy, as anything else. It needs to be really up there, and how are they going to facilitate that? Because if we're now stopping development, getting any planning consent for 50 units, for 100 units, if we're talking about 1 million homes, what is the mechanism that's going to be used? And of course, the councils are working together with the Environment Agency, Natural England, to come up with a framework of how this could be tackled. They have considered in their hierarchy that beyond water efficiency, the other things that you could do is grey water recycling. You could also use rainwater harvesting, and they've also highlighted that you could do water offsetting. We have set up our own protocol in terms of addressing that, because out of the necessity of helping our clients deliver their schemes, but also, from the point of view that if somebody doesn't lead and come up with innovative solutions, then we're all stuck. So we are leading in a way to try and demonstrate best case studies, that could be replicated and that could be permitted on other sites. So we've set up our own website, which is called wateroffsets.co.uk, where we have come up with what we're calling the water bank, which is basically a protocol where housing associations, schools, and council offices, and other people with estates register their estates that are within the affected catchments, and we match them with developers that need to offset. So a developer within the affected catchment, let's say North Sussex or Sussex, say, oh, we want to build 100 units, and we've done water efficiency, we've done grey water recycling, and we still need about 1,000 cubic meters per day. We'll look into our portfolio of registered companies that own the assets, particularly housing associations and those other organizations that own buildings, for instance, with high water demand, but who could benefit from water efficiency fittings, and then work together with both organizations so that we can demonstrate the offset that's available. We get that signed off by the Environment Agency, Natural England, and the Council, and then the water is offset to facilitate the planning consent of the development. So that's how we are doing it. And we are quite in the fortunate position that we have identified a grey water recycling system that actually facilitates the reduction of water consumption for each individual house or apartment by about 45%, which means that we can reduce the demand per person from 150 liters to about 85 liters, 83 liters.